Professor Leyb Moscovic from Bar-Ilan University. Please. Will speak to us about realism, nominalism, and beyond in the halakhic methodology of the time solvation.
The handout is supposed to be circulating now. In any case, I will be citing the relevant sources in paraphrase or in translation, so those who prefer can follow me, those who prefer can look at the printed text. Yes, this has been planned for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Okay. Okay. It is widely acknowledged that few halachists were as original and innovative as Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk. Yet the question remains, precisely what renders his conceptual approach and halachic methodology unique, and what distinguishes his mode of legal analysis, or, more precisely, some of his modes of legal analysis from those of his predecessors. This question has been raised both by academic scholars and by traditional halachists, yet a truly satisfactory answer to this question remains a desideratum, a point which has been conceded by members of both groups. In this paper, I would like to make a small contribution to this issue by considering some of Reb Chaim's unique interpretations in light of a fundamental distinction between two different approaches to legal thought. The first approach conceives of relevant objects and actions in terms of their real, concrete, physical manifestations, while the second approach does not, and instead frames matters in terms of strictly formal, law-based notions. In essence, on how we describe or define these objects, rather than on how they actually are. To illustrate, if adherents of the first view were asked, what constitutes a partition for purposes of the Sabbath laws, they would insist that it be a real physical partition, concrete and impenetrable. By contrast, adherents of the second position would be willing to make do with fictional partitions, such as those provided by a tzurat hapetach, or as it's commonly but not fully accurately termed, an eruv. For the sake of convenience, I shall call the first approach realist and the second nominalist or non-realist, although I am obviously well aware that many scholars use these terms differently. The distinction between the two approaches as defined here, then, is not a function of metaphysics, say, whether we may justifiably assume the existence of some sort of unique halachic ontology. Rather, it focuses on the difference between the imaginary and the non-imaginary, between the physically real and the physically non-real. As such, this distinction is not a reflection of the halachist's philosophical take on reality, but rather an indicator of his imagination, creativity, and originality. How does all of this bear on Reb Chaim's approach to legal thought? To answer, I would like to briefly consider two examples where the interpretations advanced by Reb Chaim differ radically from those offered by other interpreters, and these differences are best explained in light of the realism/non-realism distinction as defined above. In our first example, Reb Chaim seeks to explain the problematic Maimonidean ruling in Hilchot Edut Kaf Bet, number 1 in the handout, according to which plotting witnesses, Eidim Zomamim, whose testimony resulted in the execution of the defendant, are not punishable, although plotting witnesses whose testimony resulted in the flagellation of the defendant are. The problem here, as already noted by the classical commentaries, is obvious. According to rabbinic law, plotting witnesses, Eidim Zomamim, are punishable only if their intentions were not actually realized. In the famous rabbinic expression, kasher zamam, velo kasher asa. Why then does Maimonides rule that plotting witnesses whose testimony resulted in flagellation of the defendant are punishable, since this seems to be a case of kasher asa par excellence? Reb Chaim's explanation, found in passage number 2 on the handout, is that lashes based on the testimony of plotting witnesses do not count, since they were administered without justification. More specifically, they are not deemed court-administered lashes, even though they were in fact administered by verdict of the court. the court lacked proper authorization to administer the lashes, since the testimony on which their ruling was based was false. Hence, Reb Chaim argues, this is not considered kasher asa, and even though physically this is a clear case of kasher asa, halachically it is not. The witnesses are responsible for imposing physical lashes on the defendant, but not halachic lashes. Now, without entering a discussion of the actual basis of Maimonides' ruling, a matter which has recently been discussed at some length by Professor David Henschke in his article in the Festschrift for Professor Israel Francis, or the various difficulties which Reb Chaim's explanation raises, some of which he was cognizant of and some of which were raised by various super commentators, one thing should be clear. This interpretation is an example of halachic nominalism par excellence as defined above. For Reb Chaim does not construe the question of what constitutes kasher asa in physical terms, namely, is the defendant's body full of black and blue marks as a result of the lashes, but rather in terms of their formal status. Are they considered legally valid or court administered or not? Now, prima facie, it might appear that Reb Chaim's approach resembles that found in certain Talmudic passages, but in fact there is a huge difference between these approaches, and as such it should come as no surprise that Reb Chaim's explanation of our passage is unique among Maimonidean interpreters and was roundly criticized by a number of them as noted earlier. To be more specific, rabbinic law contains numerous legal fictions, some of which assert that a particular object or action should be disregarded or treated as non-existent for legal purposes, ro'im oto kemi she'eno, and the like. Likewise, we find a rabbinic view that an illegal action may be ineffective, yavid la mehane. However, the critical question for our purposes is whether such notions are invoked by the other sources under circumstances of the sort attested in the case here discussed by Maimonides and Reb Chaim, and the answer to this question is a resounding no. For the issue at stake with regard to the notion of kasher zamam velo kasher asa is presumably whether the witness's intention regarding the defendant was realized or not. And here that intention, that the defendant emerged from court with his body battered, most certainly was realized. Thus, the innovation of Reb Chaim here is not his adoption of a fictional or non-realistic perspective per se, but rather the context, manner, and justification for deploying such an approach, all of which seem completely different from those attested in connection with legal fictions and similar phenomena in classic rabbinic legal thought. My second example reflects an even more extreme case of legal non-realism on the part of Reb Chaim. Here, he does not just propose an unjustifiable fictional take on reality, but a notion which seems utterly inconceivable in physical terms, and in this respect I will be interfacing with the previous presentation. In other words, not just something which is not real, but something which presumably could not possibly be real. In source number 3 on the handout, Maimonides rules that a pole made of material from which benefit is prohibited, lechi shel ashera avodah zara, may be used to reduce excessive space in an alleyway in cases where such space would ordinarily render carrying on the Sabbath prohibited, even though a beam, korah, made of such material, would be unacceptable. The problem here, which actually applies to the Talmudic discussion itself, is obvious. The dimensions of the beam are deemed lacking by virtue of the Talmudic principle of katoti michtat shurei. Its measurement is crushed away. But if so, why is a pole made of such material acceptable, since poles also have minimum measurements, namely a height of 10 handbreadths? In other words, why do we invoke the principle of katote michtat shurei with regard to the dimensions of a beam, but not with regard to the dimensions of a pole? Reb Chaim solves this problem as follows, and I cite in somewhat free translation. The notion of katote michtat shurei does not mean that the object itself is considered as if it does not exist. For if so, there would not be even a modicum of the pole here. Rather, the operative principle here is that the dimensions, shurei, are crushed away, and its measurements are nullified, even though the object itself is present in unaltered form, be'enei. Thus, even though the dimensions of this pole have been crushed away, if we consider the space where it is located, we see that the entire height, in other words 10 handbreadths, is surrounded by the partition created by the pole, since it exists in unaltered form. It is only the pole itself that does not have dimensions of 10 handbreadths, for regarding this it is considered to be crushed away. Now, what does Reb Chaim mean here, and how does it resolve our problem? In a nutshell, it seems that he bases his explanation of Maimonides on a combination of two closely related claims, both of which seem inconceivable in terms of ordinary physical reality, and indeed incompatible with such reality. First, Reb Chaim draws a distinction between the pole itself and its measurements, the latter being a property which seems to be independent of the object itself. Parenthetically, in a fashion reminiscent of some interpretations of the notion of quantum entanglement or non-locality in modern physics. Hence, the dimensions of the pole are considered to be nullified, even though the pole itself is not. And indeed, it is considered fully intact. Second, with regard to the relevant legal requirements, what constitutes a private domain and consequently a valid eruv does not depend upon the dimensions of the pole itself, but rather upon the dimensions of the space surrounded by the pole. Thus, Reb Chaim distinguishes between the dimensions of the pole, that which surrounds, and they are lacking, and the dimensions of that which it surrounds, which are not lacking, even though these two should presumably be identical. Hence, we now understand, sort of, Maimonides' ruling that a pole made of idolatrous material is acceptable. While the pole's own dimensions are lacking, the dimensions of the space which it surrounds are not. And a space of the requisite dimensions so surrounded is considered a private domain in which carrying is permitted. By contrast, a horizontal being's legal status depends solely on its own dimensions and not on those of the space it surrounds, since it does not surround anything. Hence, a being made out of idolatrous material whose dimensions are considered lacking is unacceptable, whereas a pole made of such material is acceptable. As indicated, this highly non-realistic interpretation of Maimonides' ruling is unique among Maimonidean exegetes, so far as I have been able to determine. But strange as it may seem to us, for Reb Chaim, such an approach was the preferred way to solve the problem presented by Maimonides' ruling, and the same applies, as indicated, to other explanations of Reb Chaim as well. Indeed, it is noteworthy that the adoption of similarly non-realistic modes of thinking is not at all uncommon in other types of 20th and 21st century thought, especially in modern mathematics and physics. As a noticed psycholinguist Steven Pinker has written, there are many things we can't imagine, at least not in the form of a mental image. It's impossible to visualize an apple next to a lemon with neither on the right, though of course we could talk about that arrangement as I just did. Contrary to everyday physics experience, our best physics hold that space may be curved and bounded, has 11 or more dimensions, and measures out differently depending on one's reference frame. In all of these cases, our best scientific understanding of space is wildly out of line with the mind's inclinations. And here I have suggested that, mutatis mutandis, the same sometimes applies to the world of halakha as interpreted by Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk. We may now summarize. At times, Reb Chaim adopts an extreme non-realistic approach to halachic interpretation, one without parallel in the writings of other interpreters. In this paper, we have considered two examples of this sort, which themselves reflect different types of halachic non-realism. To be sure, such a sample is far too small to base any conclusions on, yet the examination of numerous other examples, again, of diverse character, points in the same direction and suggests that it is often Reb Chaim's unique form of halachic non-realism which distinguishes his approach to legal interpretation from the approaches of other halachists, including other formalists and conceptualists who preceded him. And while such explanations may be of no value for clarifying what Maimonides actually meant, when considered as an independent manifestation of legal thought, they represent and reflect legal reasoning of unparalleled creativity and originality, which is therefore worthy of our deepest attention and consideration. V'idach zilu g'molu. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any comments or questions?
Was the analogy that you were making to contemporary scientific thinking purely analogical, or is it genetic?
It's analogical.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Right. I must confess that that I came across this analogy about a week after I prepared a draft of this paper. There are, by the way, in contemporary physics, numerous interpretations of the notion of quantum entanglement, and the whole notion has been called into various types of questions by some modern physicists, but that, hopefully is a different topic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there someone who would qualify as realists?
In Reb Chaim Soloveitchik himself?
No, in general. Is there someone who would think that leading concepts
Right.
are twisted?
Right, so let me very, very briefly address this issue. In a recent article by Frederick Schauer, which appeared in the San Diego Law Review, Schauer presents this question as a sort of dispute between Jeremy Bentham on the one hand, the arch-realist, and Lon Fuller on the other hand, who's willing to adopt the position that legal concepts and language can be, quite different from those in the real world. There's definitely in general jurisprudential thinking, considerable grounds for the adoption of realistic perception of things, as per Bentham. Number two, Reb Chaim himself in some other passages does seem to accept a realistic perspective on reality, and as I indicated or tried to indicate in my opening remarks, Reb Chaim does not adopt a completely consistent approach, and we find numerous approaches to jurisprudential thought in his writings. They are apparently not the result of chronological development either, and I'm speaking exclusively of cases where the attribution to Reb Chaim can be considered certain.
Question for you and a question for you, Val, as well too. The analogy that quantum physics, in a certain sense, picking up on the theme of its application of law, it's something that is so counterintuitive in describing phenomena that in a certain sense, personally, I like to relegate it to the fact that, okay, this is a way of in a certain sense, of combining the fact that there are contradictions in the world. When we apply the halacha, isn't it easy just to say that things aren't congruent, that things don't fit, as opposed to saying that there's no way it can be intuitively understood?
I think that in a case like this, where one basically takes a property like dimensions, and by the way, this is not the only passage in which Reb Chaim does this, in which he basically describes dimensions as a property which does not adhere in the physical object of whose dimensions are being described. So I think that that's the only way to deal with that sort of instance. I must confess to something else that since I was debating about which example to cite here, and I wanted to make sure that the example fit in 15 minutes, one of the other examples which I was thinking of citing was an example when I started to prepare this, my intuitive gut reaction says, my goodness, this is simply the double split experiment applied with regard to halachic objects. So I give this a suggestion. Okay.
Well, I think I'm not the first one doing it. It's Schakengler used this idea, and that's debated as well. Actually, like, very interesting to know that on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Albert Einstein birth, there was a professor that argued that Einstein's opposition to Bohr's interpretation of complementary quantum mechanics had a deep theological meaning. And he thought that the argument between Einstein and Bohr reflected a conflict between two opposing religious outlooks. Einstein's represented the traditional monotheistic Judeo-Christian position of the Western science, whereas Bohr thinking is consistent with the approach of the Far Eastern philosophers. I'm not sure about that. I can, you can see these ideas not only in the notion of Venish Mashal, that's really explained if you look deeply at it. really the idea of complementary idea of both day and light and whatever. There are, you can see Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok, you can see seeds of that idea. But I think it helps you, and there's a lot of, you see in the footnotes, a lot of people that used the idea of Bohr, both in religious science and in legal. It's very, I think, useful idea. So even if it's not one-to-one the same thing, I think it's a very useful idea.
Thank you very much.